Craigslist is almost never the first place I go when I need to buy something, but sometimes you can get good deals on things that would otherwise be really expensive. At the time, I was searching for new workout equipment. Weights and machines are really expensive to buy new, so Craigslist was the perfect way to find used ones for cheap. Anyways, I scrolled through the site for a few days before eventually finding a posting that looked really good. It was a set of weights for a pretty good deal and was posted only a few hours ago. The poster's name was Mary, so I sent her an email and told her I was very interested in her weight set and would like to pick them up as soon as possible. Mary replied just a few minutes later, saying that she was available tonight when she got home from work at 7. It was a little bit late, but it wasn't too big of a deal for me since I wanted them as soon as possible. I agreed, and she responded with her address. Of course, I looked it up to see where it was and what the house looked like. It was 20 minutes away in a small neighborhood that I was actually familiar with, as one of my old friends used to live nearby. The house was regular sized and didn't have any real defining features other than the fact that it looked pretty old, but nothing looked too strange or gave me bad vibes, so that night I drove down there. The place was at the end of the road in a cul-de-sac, so I parked on the side of the house by their mailbox and made my way up to the front door, which was already opened. I didn't want to just walk into the house, so I knocked on the open door a few times to get their attention. A moment later, a man comes down from the hall. I was Barry to look at some workout stuff she had posted on Craigslist. The man's face lit up, and he said to come on in. He told me that Mary would be down in a few minutes as she was changing out of her work clothes. This definitely made me cautious, but he sounded genuine and believable, so I followed him into his living room where there was a set of weights on the ground. However, aside from the weights, there was nothing else in the room. No furniture or decorations at all. I think the man saw me looking around, as he quickly said that they were in the process of moving out and that's why they were trying to sell the weights. Still skeptical, I looked at them for a second, but immediately noticed that a few plates were missing. I asked him if this was everything, as I thought I saw more in the pictures. He smiled again, telling me that Mary might know where the other ones are, but then he just stood there looking at me. I got really uncomfortable and asked him if he could go check on Mary to let her know I was here. He waited for a moment and then he agreed and walked up the stairs. I was obviously beginning to worry that Mary might not even be a real person at this point, so I listened intently to make sure he was talking to someone. After a few seconds of silence, I went over to the bottom of the stairs and looked up towards the top. The man was standing there at the top, just staring at the wall, probably waiting up there to make it seem like he actually went to ask someone. I fell into a panic, knowing now that this was all a lie and I was likely in the middle of something horrible. I started to quickly walk towards the front door, trying not to alert the man, but as soon as I turned around, I heard heavy footsteps rushing down the stairs. He called out for me to wait as I ran straight out the front door and into my car. Strangely, as I drove away, the guy ran out the front door and around the side of the house. I pulled over after driving out of the neighborhood and called the police to let them know what happened, in hopes that they could figure out what was going on. I didn't really know what the man's plan was, but I was confident enough that he was up to something. The officers later came by my house and I gave them more information. They told me that the house I met him at had nobody living there for over a year, which made chills run through my body. Of course though, I couldn't really give them much helpful information other than a description of what the man looked like. And other than that, all they had to go off of was the weights that he put in the empty house that may have fingerprints on them. It worries me that he might still be out there trying to lure people into abandoned homes, but I'm also glad that I was able to make it out of there before he did whatever it was that he planned on doing. I had just graduated college and I needed a small place to stay while I searched for a new job. I worked part-time at a small grocery store, but now that I graduated, it was time to start looking for a better job. Anyways, apartments were way too expensive to rent on my own, so I was mainly looking for places with spare rooms for rent. I knew it would be awkward for a while living in someone else's house, but I didn't have much of a choice, to be honest. My old roommate from college suggested looking on Craigslist, as most other sites at the time didn't let you post single rooms in a house, or maybe it was just really hard to find them. Either way, Craigslist seemed to have a ton of options to choose from, so I stuck with it. After a few days though, I started to get frustrated, as none of the people would reply to my requests, and the ones that did would just apologize and say it was already taken. But then on Saturday morning, a new room popped up. It was nearby, cheap, and looked pretty nice. In the description, a man named Tom was advertising it as a large house with a spare bedroom for rent that also had a separate bathroom and closet. This sounded perfect to me, so I emailed him about my interest and then went to work. I knew the listing had just been posted that morning, so I felt confident that I was the first one to contact him. On my lunch break, I checked my emails and Tom had replied, asking me to come and view it that afternoon. I knew I'd be tired after work, but I also really wanted this place, so I agreed and we set a time. After work, I drove straight there, which was only about 10 minutes. From the outside, the house looked really nice. It honestly just looked like a regular medium-sized neighborhood home. I parked on the side of the road and walked up to the door, then lightly knocked. After 30 seconds, I knocked again, a little bit harder this time. A minute later, I pulled my phone out to text Tom, but just before I sent it, he opened the door and invited me in. I immediately noticed he was sweating a lot, as if he had just finished a long workout, and he smelled awful. I didn't want to be rude or anything, so I just ignored it. He began walking me around the ground level floor, showing me the kitchen and the living room. He mentioned that he didn't use these rooms often, so I wouldn't have to worry about getting in his way. From the look of the rooms though, it seemed as though he used them too often. Old dishes were piled up in the sink and the couch had stains all over it. I really didn't like how dirty the whole place was, and it was strange that in the pictures it looked like the house was really clean. One thing I remembered specifically was that the living room had a brown leather couch in the picture, but the couch that was actually there was black. I figured Tom had probably used the pictures of the house from years ago before it sold. I was a bit annoyed at the dishonesty of it, but all that really mattered was my room, which was upstairs. Tom led the way to the stairs, then stopped when he reached the bottom of the steps and held his hand out in a gesturing manner as if he wanted me to head up first. I got a weird and uncomfortable feeling as I started up the stairs, as Tom didn't follow me. He stayed at the bottom and smiled, saying that my room would be the first one on the left. I continued to the top and took a couple steps into the hallway before a soft thud came from behind the door to what was said to be my room. Don't. I looked back down the stairs at Tom, whose smile was now completely gone. Slit. He replied in an annoyed tone, telling me that it was just one of his friends staying the night and not to worry about it, then urged me to check out the room for myself as he was sure that I'd like it. I was definitely pretty nervous at this point, scared even. Why wouldn't he have told me that someone else was here? It seemed like something that I should know. Everything started adding up, and all I wanted was to get out of there right away. Tried to act confident and began walking down the stairs as I explained that the place wasn't going to work out for me. He didn't seem to like that answer, and he moved his body to block most of the bottom of the stairs. I stood a couple steps away, firmly told him that I needed to leave. He asked me again to check out the bedroom to at least see if I liked it, and again I said I was not interested. He looked at me for a moment. Then, to my surprise, he smiled and said okay, stepping aside. I quickly walked past him and straight out the front door. I don't know what was going on in that house, but something didn't feel right about any of it. I even felt lucky to have been able to leave so easily. In the moment, I thought I was going to have to force my way out. I checked Craigslist a couple hours later, and the posting had been removed. I still wonder who and what was in that room upstairs. For all I know, it could have just been an empty room, but something tells me that it was something much worse. I lived with a friend of mine, who I'll refer to as Nick, in a small house for a few years during college. He was my roommate for the first year, and then we decided to move out of the dorms and share the rent on a house since we both had decent enough jobs. This was both of our first times renting a place, so we didn't really know how to budget properly. After a few months, everything was okay, but it was almost a year in when we realized that this place was eating up both of our bank accounts. So the obvious solutions were to either move out or find another roommate. Neither of us wanted to leave, so we started the search for a roommate. We started by asking all of our other friends, but none of them were interested, though really the only option was to put up a post online. I made a post on Facebook Marketplace, and Nick made a post on Craigslist. Again, neither of us have ever done this, and it felt kind of weird, but we knew we didn't have much of a choice. A few weeks went by with just a couple of responses, but none of them seriously considering moving in, before Nick shows me an email he got from someone named Sam replying to his Craigslist post. The guy seemed legit, and the following day he came over to view the house. I should mention, he was a couple years older than us and had just graduated, but he seemed pretty nice and looked clean and everything, so we were glad to have him. He agreed to the split of rent and moved in the next week. In the few months following, Sam would hang out with us a lot, and we actually got to know him pretty well. But then all of a sudden, he became very closed off for some reason. Nick and I would barely ever see the guy, and when we did, he wouldn't even talk. He would sit in his room for the most part, with his door shut, and would only come out to get food or to go to work. It didn't bother me necessarily, I just found it a little strange. Anyways, it was around month 4 with him being there that things started to take a turn for the worse. I had just gotten home from work, and immediately as I walked through the door, Nick calls my name quietly from the living room. Going on. He mentions that Sam was home, so to not talk too loud. And he tells me about a strong smell he noticed when passing his room today. I told him I hadn't noticed it. He points down the hall towards Sam's room and tells me to quietly walk past and see if I notice. So I got up and made my way quietly down the hall towards Sam's door. I didn't even have to get very close to smell what he was talking about. It was awful and really disgusting. I had no idea what it was and had definitely never smelled it in the house before. Nick suggested we ask him what it was, and I agreed. Both went to his door, trying not to breathe in too hard, and knocked. Then knocked again and again, calling out to him. Didn't answer. Nick said he was sure that Sam was in there, but after a couple more minutes we just gave up and figured we'd ask him tomorrow. It was already pretty late at this point, so we both made a quick dinner and then ate while watching TV in the living room, and then we both went to bed. The next day, I caught Sam on his way out of the house and asked him what the smell was last night. I was just taking out the trash. Quickly left and drove off. That answer didn't really make any sense to me, but I didn't want to press him too hard. I told Nick later that day, and he agreed that it was weird, but didn't know what else to do, so we left it at that. Another couple weeks go by. Again, Sam barely talked to us, but the smell had gone away by now. I got home from work late one night, and Nick and Sam were both in their rooms, already asleep probably, so I pretty much went straight up to my room and fell asleep as well. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up hearing some movement below my room, which was where Sam's room was located downstairs. I listened for a couple minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing, but eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, Sam ran out of the house to go to work as usual. However, he didn't return home that night. Another couple days would go by, and he still hadn't come home. I called him multiple times, and his phone instantly went to voicemail. We were actually starting to get worried and decided to check his room to see if there were any clues as to what was going on. His room was pretty messy, and actually kind of looked like a lot of his stuff had been packed up and taken out. I also found a pair of glasses in his drawer with some other random belongings, which was weird because Sam didn't wear glasses. He left some clothes and all of his furniture behind though, which made us believe that he didn't just move out suddenly. Nick ended up calling the police to notify them about Sam possibly being missing, and an officer arrived that night to investigate and ask us questions. Told him everything we knew and let him look at his room. Nick also gave him a picture that we had taken together back when Sam first moved in. After that, we didn't get an update until a week later. A different detective called us and informed us that the identity of the man in the photo with us was not Sam. They said a family member recognized them as their missing son who had been gone for almost a year. After that, the case got a lot more complicated, and we didn't have much helpful information because the guy pretty much lied about everything he told us. So after a little bit, we lost contact and stopped getting updates. As far as we were told, the man was just some regular guy that was living with his parents, who suddenly went missing for no known reason. He never came back to our house though, and I'm not sure if he was ever found. It's definitely the most interesting and creepy experience I've had though. Just knowing that I was living in the same house as someone who made up a completely fake identity and was legally missing gives me chills every time I think about it. It's pretty hard not to assume that this man was trying to hide from the police because of something he had done, or was still doing. Craigslist is not something I would use often. I mean, less than once a year for sure. But sometimes it's just the easiest way to sell something that would otherwise be impossible to sell quickly. However, after this happened to me about 3 years ago, I never used Craigslist again. I was 22 at the time and lived in a very small house with a roommate of mine for over a year before he moved out. The lease ended in a few months anyways, and without a roommate to split the rent with, I could no longer afford the property. Thus, I had to move out as well. It wasn't too hard to find an apartment. It was way smaller than the house was. This meant that I pretty much needed to get rid of all of my furniture. The couch was basically unused, and my roommate and I bought it just over a year ago when he moved in. So it would be a total waste to just put it on the side of the road for someone to pick up. The thing was expensive. I could really use any extra money to help with the move, so of course I resorted to Craigslist. This was my first time ever selling anything on the site, as I was always the one to buy stuff instead. I'd never had any weird experiences, aside from just the awkward feeling of being in someone else's house and meeting a stranger. Though, being the person selling this time, felt much more comfortable since I would be at my house. Anyway, it took a bit over 2 weeks for someone who was seriously interested to reply to the ad and ask to come check it out. He ended up calling me to ask a few questions about it. Honestly, it made me feel better, since I assumed he was probably just trying to be safe and make sure I wasn't some creep. His name was David, and he told me that he moved into a new house and needed some cheap furniture to fill the space. I mentioned that I was in the exact opposite position, leaving my house for an apartment. He responded, asking politely why I was leaving, which I told him that my roommate left, so I couldn't really afford it anymore. He sounded nice though, which I guess made me tell him more than I should have. We set a time after we were both off of work on a Saturday evening around 6 o'clock. When that time came around, I left the front door open and waited. I sat on the couch for over an hour just waiting for the guy to show up before eventually shutting the front door and going to the kitchen to make some food, assuming he just bailed on me. But then the doorbell rang only minutes later. It was 7:30 at this point, so I was obviously a little upset, but I tried to fake a smile and opened the door. "Hey, I'm David," he said as he held his hand out for a handshake. He was a tall, larger man with a very large grin on his face. I shook his hand and invited him inside, showing him into the living room. He looked at it for a second, nodding his head in approval, before I heard footsteps outside the front door, followed by it opening and 2 more men walking inside. "Sorry, my buddies that are moving. You don't mind?" "Oh, yeah," I said nervously, knowing that there wasn't much I could do about it. Honestly, I was starting to get really uneasy though, and had a bad feeling in my gut. I tried to not think about it, telling myself I was overthinking it, but my feelings would not suppress. David walked to the other side of the couch and knelt down a bit, as if he was inspecting something, and he stood back up. "What's this over here?" he said, pointing down at the side of the couch. With the other 2 men standing behind me, I reluctantly walked over to where he was standing and looked down at the couch. He pointed again, as if he wanted me to get down and look. The 2 other men came closer, standing in front of me, while David was behind me. Slowly, I knelt down and looked at the side, still not seeing anything. I could feel all of them breathing over me, making me feel powerless and terrified. "I'm just messing with you. Nothing there," David exclaimed, giving me a hard pat on the back as I stood up. I let out a nervous chuckle and moved myself a few steps away. I could see the other men had creepy smiles on their faces as they looked at David as if plotting something. I tried my best to remain calm, think of a way out of this situation. They were in my house. I couldn't just leave. I was too scared to ask them to. Don't like it? I asked, trying to speed up this process. David looked at his friends and then back at me. His happy, smiling expression had shifted. There was a very odd moment of silence as I stared into David's empty eyes. A calm before the storm. One of the men tackled me to the ground, pinning me down aggressively. My instant reaction to resist was overpowered by his strength, and I gave up quickly, just hoping to not be any further harmed. David and the other man ran through the house, looting it of everything valuable, creating chaos and mess in all of the rooms. The man on top of me continued to hold me tightly, pushing my head into the hard wooden floor with all of his weight. After a few minutes, David called out by the front door, and the man got off of me and ran out of the house. I heard their truck pull out and speed off, as I laid on the ground in shock, pain, terror. After a couple minutes, I gathered myself up and slowly stumbled to the front door to close and lock it. I called the cops soon after. To no one's surprise, David wasn't his real name, nor was the email or phone number attached to any identifiable person. They collected some fingerprints around the house and took pictures of their shoe prints on the ground, but the case ran cold with no suspects at all. The only thing they were able to identify was that the shoe prints left at my house were the same as ones left at someone else's house a few weeks ago during the similar attack and robbery. That person was also alone in their home. It's suspected that they try to find those who live alone, so obviously I kind of fucked myself over by telling the man about my roommate who had left. Either way, that experience has caused me a lot of stress and anger. I was blinded by the feeling of safety being in my own home and was taken advantage of because of it. Sites like Craigslist are dangerous, and people need to be more aware of the dangers of willingly inviting unknown, seemingly innocent people into their homes. I tried buying a truck off of Craigslist some years ago. Before you say anything, it was a great price, and I wasn't in the best financial situation. I'd never actually used Craigslist before, but I knew it was an average place for people to sell their stuff, which meant that it was usually cheap. Even with the cheap prices of cars on the site, I still had to ask my dad for money because I didn't even have the few $1,000s in my account that I needed in cash for a cheap car. After a bit of scrolling though, I messaged this guy who posted his truck for $4,000, and he got back pretty quickly, answering all of my questions on it and giving what sounded like honest answers. He basically said that it wasn't the nicest looking, but it'll get you where you gotta be in a reliable manner. Interested, he agreed to meet me at a Burger King that was a halfway point of where we both lived. I got there first, taking an Uber, and he showed up maybe 5 minutes later. We chatted for a bit, and he told me more about the truck, mentioning minor issues it's given him in the past, but nothing too serious. After all, I didn't have the money to be picky. Of course, I asked if I could test drive it, to which he said that he knew a less busy parking lot and I could test drive it there. Honestly, I was like, alright, whatever, and I took my phone out to get a quick Uber, but he said it was just across the street and that we could just ride together. I didn't want to be rude and had never done something like this before, so I kind of assumed it was a normal thing. Looking back, I should have told him to F off, but I was young and he was old. Well, for some reason I trusted him. As I got inside, he asked me if I had my license on me, which was just another reason I trusted him. He seemed like he was a genuine guy. Started driving, but we went a little further than across the street, probably a few blocks away from the Burger King, this empty parking lot away from the main road, which was the first red flag to come up, even though it should have been the second or third. Alright, let's bet you, he said, putting the car in park. As we were passing each other around the car, he threw me the keys, saying heads up, but they landed nowhere near me. I mean, I would have had to dive into the concrete to catch them. Awkwardly, I went to pick them up, and just as I bent down, I felt the weight of his foot slam against my side, and before I knew it, he was on top of me, ripping my wallet out of my back pocket and running back towards the truck. I immediately grabbed the keys from the ground, thinking he must have forgotten them in the heat of the moment, and that I could possibly force a trade. Unfortunately though, the keys he threw at me must have just been fake, because he just drove away, leaving me stranded there stupidly. What makes everything worse is that it all happened so fast I couldn't even get the damn license plate. I still had my phone though, and the first thing I did was cancel the only card I had because I couldn't risk him spending money I didn't have, and then I called the police. I walked back to the Burger King and filed a report when they met me there, but with only the description of a rusty white truck and an average middle-aged white guy. Nothing ever came of it. He took the ad down, and his email wasn't even a real name. Apparently it was just named after a video game character, and again, I didn't get his plates. So all in all, I lost $4,000 of straight cash, had to wait for a new card in the mail, had to get a new license, and they didn't even catch the guy. Moral of the story is, don't use Craigslist, and don't be as stupid as I was. I used to work for a big maid company, but I left after my ex-coworker told me that she was making more than triple just working by herself and listing ads on Craigslist Marketplace. So of course, I looked into it and eventually began doing that as well. I was making amazing money for close to 7 months before anything weird happened. Ever since, I have never encountered someone that creepy, and I hope I never do again. I had answered a usual email from someone asking me to clean their house. The way it works is they tell me what rooms they want me to do, and I charge the price based on how long I think it will take. To do this, I have to go to their house to make an estimate, or they can send me a video walkthrough. This is the way we did it at my old company, except I charge a much better price, and people feel more comfortable with the same person coming over every week. The man had sent me a video walkthrough of his house, and it was very clean already, which happens with a lot of clients who just want to maintain that cleanliness and have someone get the nitty-gritties. We set a date and time, and a few days later I went for the first time clean. I was going to be there for about 3.5 hours, doing the top and bottom floor, no basement, and giving extra care to the kitchen and bathroom tiles. He greeted me at the door and led me upstairs so I can work my way down, and this is where everything went to shit. I began cleaning, expecting him to leave, but he kind of just stands there watching me, which I sometimes have happen with older women who are control freaks. But this guy wasn't looking at what I was cleaning. He was eyeing me. I ask him if he wants me to do anything else, and he just stands there for a second. No, when I saw your ad on Craigslist, I knew I had to have you. At first, I didn't think of this in any kind of flirty way. I just saw this as some older white guy telling me, a Mexican woman, that I was meant to be good at cleaning. I didn't really care. I've heard it all the time. They usually just say things out of ignorance, but I wanted the money, so I kept my mouth shut and faked a response. Oh, well, he asked that people they out in the room. That way. He said no problem. Clearly there was, because while he left that room, he went to the room just across the hallway and sat on the bed and watched me from there. At this point, I was getting creeped out, and the thought of him watching me for 3.5 hours was very unsettling. I had an idea. After I dusted, I started to vacuum, going behind the door so I could move it, leaving it only cracked open slightly, so that for the rest of this room at least, you wouldn't be able to look at me. I just had to get through this day, get paid, and never come here again. I moved to the bathroom that was connected to the room. I was about 20 minutes in and scrubbing grout when I felt that I was being looked at again. I turned around and sure enough, he was there in the doorway. Sorry to bother you. I got to tell you, the vanity has it was my wife's. She died years gone. And really rough. Going through all that, I wanted to confirm it. I said okay, and after a moment of silence and awkward staring, he finally left. I wondered why he didn't just put in special instructions to not touch the master bathroom vanity if it were so important. But as I was cleaning around it, I noticed there was some makeup on the counter that I knew had only come out a few years ago. This was 2017, and he said his wife died in 2009, but the makeup lying on the counter had a few products that came out no earlier than 2015, and I knew this because I was excited when they came out. And for what it's worth, if this vanity had been preserved, it would have looked a lot worse. If I wasn't sketched out before, I definitely was now. Thankfully, for the rest of the time I was upstairs, he didn't look at me or talk to me. I was dreading going downstairs, but I was halfway done and just needed to get the rest of it over with. I got to the kitchen and started there. From the kitchen, you could see the living room, and again, something was off. This guy had 0 pictures hanging up. I've cleaned so many homes, hundreds at this point. I've never seen a house with no pictures. Even people that lived alone had at least holiday cards of other people's families on their fridge. I don't know why it freaked me out so much, but it did. And right when I decided I was just gonna do the rest really fast and cut some of the costs for him, he appeared in the archway and asked if I could do him a favor. I hesitantly asked what, to which he said he knows it specifically says no basement, but he forgot he's having guests over next week, and that was where the pool table and everything was, and he just wants it quickly vacuumed. I told him I was on a really tight schedule and wasn't sure if I could do it today, but maybe next time. He then said I could skip the dining room because it's never in use and just do the basement floors instead. I responded, explaining that I could come back tomorrow and do the whole basement instead of just the floors if he wanted, just trying to push it off a little bit. But this was when his whole demeanor changed. He started to get really weird and said that he just wants the floor done and he couldn't understand why I wouldn't just do it today. He went on to say that he and his wife really needed the floors done down there. His wife? The one that had died years ago. That was the moment I realized that this guy was clearly trying to do something horrible, but I didn't know what. Told him, if I have time I will. Well, can I just show you what needs to be done down there? It won't take long, just wait. Knowing he wasn't going to stop, I pretended to get a phone call, so I went to the other room. I then called my friend to explain what was happening. He was still watching me carefully, so I spoke in Spanish, praying he didn't know any. She agreed to drive to this address and make sure when I left he didn't try to follow me, or worse. I got off the phone and told him that I had a family emergency and I could come back tomorrow to finish everything, which was obviously a lie. He looked at me with the coldest look on his face and replied, "Don't bother." Then he walked upstairs while I gathered my things. I knew I wasn't gonna get paid, but at this point I just felt lucky to leave. My friend got there while I was loading my trunk, and the guy was staring at me through the window the entire time. I left. When I got home, I called the police to tell them what happened, but there wasn't much they can do. Since he didn't break the law, he was just being creepy. They basically just told me the obvious, to not go there again, which I clearly wasn't going to. Just a reminder for everyone, if you provide a service through sites like Craigslist, there's no sure way to tell who's weird and who's not. So make sure to trust your gut and always let someone know the address you're going to and when you're supposed to leave, just in case. I don't know what was wrong with that guy or what he had planned for me in that basement, but I hope nobody else has to find out. I was using Craigslist as a means of selling some of my old, unused things I had stashed away in my house. I had plans to move out in the next few months, so I was just trying to organize what I needed from what I didn't need. That's when I found my old motor tools. They were high quality and still functional, but I had gotten battery-powered ones to replace them not long ago. With no use for them anymore, took a couple pictures and posted them up on Craigslist. I had listed a power drill, driver, and matching tool set for $80. Considering they weren't that old and still fully functional, it was a really good deal. It didn't take long to get responses. In just an hour, I got 2 replies to my post. One of them emailed me asking if $50 would be okay, but I politely declined. The other reply stated that they were very interested and wanted to buy them that same night for the listed price. I agreed and said I was available at 5 if he wanted to swing by and pick them up. Never let anyone into my house when selling things. I'd always just bring the stuff out to my driveway and talk to them there. It was a well-trafficked neighborhood street, so I wasn't worried about anyone attempting something out in the open. As I usually did, I was going to stand out in the driveway with the items a bit before 5 and wait for them so that I could make the transaction as quick as possible. But just past 4:30 was a knock at the door. I looked out, seeing a man standing there with his red car parked in the driveway. I opened the door a crack, asking who he was. The man said he was here to buy the tools that were on Craigslist and admitted to being early. I told him to hold on for a minute and to just wait in his car, as I wasn't expecting him yet. He hesitated, making the interaction more awkward than it should have been. But then he turned around. Once he walked away, I got all the tools together and met him at the top of the driveway. I had an outlet outside for him to test the tools with, and he seemed satisfied with it. "About 20, said while holding the drill. "The deal was 80. I could do a little lower, but 20 is low," I said nicely, though I was slightly annoyed because he had already agreed to pay $80 for that, and $20, the total ripoff. He put the drill down, and without even looking at me, he walked back to his car and drove away. I was confused and upset, feeling like I'd been played and just had wasted my time. I got the tools back inside and just went on with my night, trying not to let myself get too upset about it. Really, it was just a small inconvenience. At least, that's what I thought. A couple hours later, I walked by the front windows, and out the corner of my eye, I saw that same red car. It was parked just down the road, 3 houses away from mine. Looked closely, trying to be sure that it was that same man, but nobody was inside it. It was an empty parked car, so I had no way of knowing for sure. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence and carried on. Another hour would go by. I was just going on with my night, making food and watching TV. Then someone knocked on my door. I was a little shaken. I chose to ignore it and hope that whoever it was would go away. Obviously, the man from earlier was my first thought. Only 30 seconds passed before they knocked again. "Hey, me. I decided I'll take the tools. I brought the money," he yelled from the other side of the door. I didn't believe him at all. It all came together in my mind that that car that I'd seen an hour ago was his, meaning that he'd been stalking my house all night. I didn't respond and instead called the police, informing them of the man's name and the car he had. The man called out several more times, saying he wanted to buy the tools, but then it went silent for a minute. I was still standing by my couch, looking toward the front door. Another minute passed. Wasn't sure what to do. Police were already on their way and would be here any minute, so I felt safe enough to be able to check out the windows. I quietly walked over to the window that was beside the door. But then suddenly, I heard something hit the side of the house with great force. The sound was followed by leaves rustling and footsteps running away. I looked out the windows, saw the guy running with a limp onto his car. The police turned in at the perfect time though, stopping him halfway. It surprised me to hear that the man admitted to a lot. He said he planned on robbing me, but I wouldn't let him into the house, which complicated things for him. Additionally, tried climbing the tree on the side of my house and jumping onto the roof, but he missed, hitting the side and falling on his leg. Thing is though, he was armed with a knife, and the roof he tried to jump on was just under my second-story window, which after checking, was unlocked. So, he had made the jump. He actually would have gotten inside. He claimed it was just an attempted robbery, but claims just that. I stopped using Craigslist, and even to this day, I lock every single window in my house, even the ones that I think are unreal. I used Craigslist many years ago to find a room for rent. I was looking for a house to stay at and be able to split rent with a roommate or roommates. It took maybe a week to find a place that was suitable for me, and several phone calls with the owner before I was ready to move in. The owner who was to be my roommate seemed like a really normal, nice guy who was similar in age as me. He told me all about the place and what to expect, and I also felt like we connected well. With everything seeming perfect, I was getting really excited. I didn't have much to move, so I packed it all up and stuffed it in the trunk of my car, and in just a few days, I drove out 30 minutes to my soon-to-be home. It was located outside of the main town and in more of a woodsy terrain. It had a long driveway leading far from the road. Pulling in though, it was not as I'd expected. It was a very old, wooden home. I knew it was passed down from his parents, but this place looked to be at least 100 years old. Pictures of the inside that I'd seen on Craigslist looked to be fairly modern, though I assumed they had to have done some pretty big renovations. I left everything in my car as I went up to the door and knocked. Aaron, the owner, came and showed me around. While the outside was not so impressive, the inside was the opposite. Very well maintained, clean, and definitely had been renovated not long ago. I was really happy with everything, moved my things in that night. Several days went by with no issues. It didn't even feel like I'd found this place on Craigslist. It felt like I was just living with a friend. Aaron worked in town though he was gone most of the time, and I worked from home, so I got to have the whole house to myself. Well, at the whole house, there was one door that was always locked. It wasn't any of my business, and I knew that, so I never brought it up with Aaron. But it still got me wondering. It was almost definitely the basement door, but this was odd because he said the house was a one-story home, without mentioning anything about having a basement. Another couple days went by before something happened. Aaron brought home some fast food for dinner, and then went to bed early because he had work the next day. Stayed up a while longer, then did the same. Laying in bed though, I had trouble falling asleep. There wasn't any reason for this, it was just one of those nights. But after a while, I heard Aaron's bedroom door open. I was listening, because there was nothing else to do, but no sounds came. I waited a whole 2 or 3 minutes before he started walking, slowly, down the hall towards my door. Just as he was passing though, stopped. I heard the floorboards creak, followed by the door thump softly, if he was pressing up against it. He stayed there behind the door for a while. I don't even know how long, but then he walked away, out back toward his room, the other way, toward the main hallway. Then a door opened, closed. I didn't know what to think. It was really weird and creepy, but also I'd known Aaron for a while now. Didn't see him as a weird person. But what was he doing? And where did he go? I stayed awake as long as I could, waiting to hear him come back. He never did. Over the next few nights, I noticed a pattern. Every time I would go to bed, about 30 minutes later, Aaron would open his door, stand still for a minute, then walk to my door, stand still again, then leave and go into the locked door. He never slept in his room. He always slept somewhere behind the weird locked door. What made it so creepy was that he was trying so hard to keep a secret from me. I decided one night that I was going to figure this all out, because I was beginning to feel unsafe. I went to bed and waited for Aaron to do his usual routine. He opened his bedroom door and walked over to mine. Then, as soon as I heard him unlock and open the other door, I got up and quickly went into the hallway, catching him standing by the open door. He looked back at me, clearly startled. "Hey, is everything okay, Aaron?" I asked. He just stared at me, eyes still open wide from the scare I gave him. "Why do you go into that door every night?" I broke the silence, getting impatient. We were standing on opposite sides of the long, dark hallway, but I could sense that something was wrong with him. We stared at each other still. I took a step closer. "Aaron!" As soon as I spoke his name, he ran around the corner and straight to the back door, opening it and continuing to run for the trees. I looked out the back door, seeing him disappear into the dark woods. I was shaking, horrified at what just happened. I have no words to describe the unknown thoughts running through my head. I closed the back door, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and walked over to the door Aaron had opened. It was in fact a basement. There was no light switch, and it clearly had not been renovated like the rest of the house. The walls were old, decaying wood. I debated whether or not to go down. I was so intrigued and curious, but terrified as well. The longer I stood there, the more afraid I became. I turned and ran back to my room, packed everything I could into 2 suitcases, stuffed them in my car, and drove away, never looking back. I never talked to Aaron again, and he never tried to contact me either. I didn't know what was going on with him, or what he was doing in that house, but I didn't want to be involved. After a while, I forgot about it, but almost 5 years later, I found myself wondering about it again. I looked up the house online and found some strange things. It had been torn down years ago. There was an article from 5 years ago, a few months after I left, stating that the house was abandoned. To me, this meant that when Aaron ran away that night, he never came back. I kept reading. It stated that the house was torn down due to what they described as criminal findings. It didn't go into any more detail about what those criminal findings were. This really had me shaken up for a few weeks. Things like this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, but you can never be too careful. I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened to me 3 years ago. I had just signed a lease for a small house in the town I lived in. Having been living in an apartment for a few years, I didn't have a lot of furniture or large house decorations to fill the space in my rental. While I had a decent-sized couch and TV stand, I only had a mini TV that I wanted to put up in my bedroom since it was so small. Not having a ton of money to work with, though, took to Craigslist to find a larger TV for the living room. Found a few nice flat-screen TVs listed on the site. They were all over my budget though, and honestly, a lot nicer than I actually needed. I just wanted a large TV to fill the space in my living room. I didn't actually care about the quality of the picture on the TV. Anyway, I finally found one that seemed to work with what I needed. It was cheap, large, and was said to be in working condition. It was an old flat-screen TV from probably 10 years ago. Compared to today, they aren't even considered flat screens anymore. They're usually 3 to 4 inches thick and really heavy. I sent the owner an email and continued with my search. Finding nothing else worth looking into, I just hoped for the best with that one TV. It wasn't until the following morning that I received a response to my email. The owner introduced himself as Mitch and said he'd love to show me the TV whenever I was available. I don't know if I just read it in a weird way or what, but he seemed to be over-the-top excited about this. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I just figured it was a happy old man or something. Said I could do any day this week after I got off work at 6. Mitch said tomorrow at 6:30 would be perfect for him, leaving his address at the bottom of the email, along with a Google Calendar invite to an event labeled as Craigslist TV. I accepted it, though I wasn't really sure what the purpose of it was, and it was definitely not a normal thing people do, but it didn't affect me in any way. I got my truck emptied out, and the next day I went to work, then went straight to his address afterward. It was dark out by now. When I pulled into his driveway, I saw all the lights were on inside. Checked one last time to make sure I had all the cash on hand, and got out of my truck and went to the front door. Walking up, I could see that the front door was partially open. There was no screen door or anything, one main door. Thinking it was left open for me, I leaned over and peeked inside, but didn't see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. Right when the bell rang, I heard something drop on the far end of the house. Then it went quiet. There was something about that noise that made me start getting nervous. After a moment, I decided I had a bad feeling about it and was just going to leave. But then footsteps came from behind the door, which then opened slightly wider, revealing a man. "Something?" he said, half his body still behind the door. "Oh, yeah, I was here to look at your scheduled for 6:30 today." The man looked at me for a second. "All right." He opened the door completely and let me inside. I will say, at that moment, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't acting at all like he was in the emails. I expected a happy old man, not a large, grumpy, middle-aged dude. But I was already inside by the time all the alarms were going off in my head. TV was in the room right next to the door, so he stood there while I looked at it. Yeah, this looked good. I'll take it," I said, not even knowing if it worked or not. But I wanted to get this over with quickly. Held out the money. He looked at it for a moment, and back at me. He reached out and took it, shoved it in his pocket, and without giving me any time to react, grabbed me by the shoulder and shoved me back towards the door, yelling at me, "Breathe." I didn't argue, sprinted out to my truck and drove away. Not long after, pulled to the side and called the police to let them know I'd been robbed. The whole time I was just thinking about how stupid they were, aiding me at their own house, robbing me, letting me go, knowing that I knew where they lived. But when the police got to the house, called me back, I was in complete shock, hearing what they told me. Over that week, though, things became more clear. The man I met at the house was not Mitch. Mitch, the owner of the house, was found unconscious in the kitchen. Thankfully, he survived, though he had some pretty bad injuries. The man I met at the door was another customer Mitch was meeting from Craigslist to pick up some kitchenware he was also selling. He ended up beating and robbing Mitch, likely just minutes before I showed up. What's even crazier, that Mitch had sent that man a Google Calendar invite as well, and the man accepted it, probably unknowing that I showed his email, which just so happened to be his first and last name. Was caught within a few days. During this whole case, I got to actually meet Mitch, and he was indeed a happy old man, even despite what happened. I stumbled upon a Craigslist ad for a beautiful antique piano at an unbeatable price. I'd been really searching for one for a while, and these types of pianos can be unbelievably expensive if the seller knows its true value. I emailed the seller, and he quickly replied. He seemed friendly and said he was excited to meet me and show me the piano. The address he gave me was a bit off the beaten path, out in a rural area outside of town, but I didn't think anything of it. Thursday evening, right on schedule, I hopped in my car and started the drive out there. It was already dark, and the winding roads were getting more and more questionable as I went along. I was quickly becoming unnerved. When I finally reached the address that he had given me, it looked like an old church. I guess I just didn't know the difference between an old farmhouse and an old church, though. They all kind of looked the same in my mind, so I thought that's what it was. I saw the man walking out of the front door, waving at me and calling my name. Hesitantly, I got out of my car and began to make my way over to him. He was tall and thin, with dull, beady eyes and a quirky smile. He seemed friendly, but there was something off about him. "Welcome," he said. "I hope the drive wasn't too bad." I nodded, trying to compose myself and push aside the uneasy feelings. He led me inside the place, which I immediately noticed that it likely was actually an old church, but it had been converted into some sort of makeshift musical instrument museum. There was all kinds of gear lining the walls: drums, banjos, guitars, and a host of other instruments. I didn't spot the piano, though. I turned and asked him where the piano was. "It's downstairs," he replied. I hesitated, something not feeling right with the way he said it. Nonetheless, I followed him down a narrow hallway where a staircase led down below. He grabbed a heavy flashlight before starting down those stairs. As we reached the bottom, he turned to me and gave me a lopsided grin. "It's down here, don't worry." He shined the flashlight on a small room off to the side. I hesitated, unsure if I should go in, but I was too far in to back out now. We entered the room. The man flicked the lights on, which were dim, just enough to see the piano sitting in the center. The problem was, it looked nothing like the picture in the ad. The wood was chipping, keys were missing from one end of the keyboard, and it was quite a bit smaller than I anticipated. "It's not quite what I was expecting," I said, trying to sound polite, but my disappointment was clear in my voice. "I'm sorry it's not quite what you were looking for," he replied. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, watching my every move. Felt like a trapped animal, self-aware and panicky. The whole setup was weird, and I felt like I needed to leave. "Thanks for this. I think I'll pass on it though." I looked over at the man, who was still leaning against the wall with a crooked smile on his face. "Is there anything else you'd like to look at?" he asked. "But no, I'm okay," I stuttered, feeling threatened by his tone. "I think that's all for today." I quickly rushed out of the room, entering the dark, unlit hallway. I managed to find the stairs and quickly made my way up, leaving out the front door. Even though I had managed to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister going on. Maybe it was the way John had looked at me, or the way he acted, or just the tone in his voice. When I got home, I opened my laptop and looked up the address. Online, it showed a picture of the old church. It was labeled as a historical music museum, open only on the weekends for viewings. I looked into it further and didn't find any information about them selling anything. My body shook and I closed my laptop. I had likely escaped something awful. I was already skeptical with sites like Craigslist, but after that, I was done. I haven't used Craigslist or even Facebook Marketplace after that night. Because really, when you think about it, you're taking a gamble on your life over some used items. Don't use Craigslist, and if you do, never let your guard down. Having just moved to a new city, I turned to Craigslist to find someone to share my new apartment with. As soon as I saw his post, I contacted him. His name was James. We exchanged a few emails and phone calls, and things seemed to be going well. A few days later, we agreed to meet in person to discuss the details. At first, James seemed like a friendly and easygoing guy. He was in his early 30s and kind of reminded me of myself. We talked for a while about our interests and hobbies, and he shared some funny stories about his previous roommates. As we were wrapping up our conversation, James suddenly got very serious. There's something I have to tell you. It's kind of important. I have a condition that sometimes makes some people uncomfortable." I looked at him, confused. "What condition?" "Sleepwalking," he said, "and it's pretty severe. I just want you to know that up front, in case it was a problem." I shrugged and said it was fine, not a big deal. The first few weeks went by without incident. James seemed like a great roommate, and we got along well. But then I started noticing strange things around the apartment in the morning. Food would be missing from the fridge, and things would be moved around. I assumed it was just James sleepwalking, but didn't give it much thought. One night, I was awakened by a strange noise coming from James's room. At first, it sounded like he was talking to himself, but then I realized it was something else. A low, growling sound that sent chills down my spine. I got up, quietly crept to his door, and listened. The growling got louder and more intense. I opened the door slowly. As I peered inside, saw James standing in the middle of the room, his eyes closed. It was a strange and unsettling sight. I felt like I was seeing something that I wasn't supposed to see, and chose to back away and go back to my room. The sounds went on for a few more minutes before they stopped. In the morning, I refrained from mentioning anything to James so as to not embarrass him. He seemed to be acting normal anyway, so I brushed it all under the rug and forgot about it. Another few days went by, and I found myself waking up occasionally to footsteps in the hallways or doors opening and closing, and sometimes even James making that same growling type noise. I knew it was just James sleepwalking, so it didn't frighten me, but I still had trouble falling asleep unless I heard him go back to bed. One night, though, I woke up to James's bedroom door closing. Usually he closes the door softly, but this time it sounded like he had slammed it. My eyes shot open and I stared at my door as his footsteps slowly crept over and stopped. I could see his shadow underneath the crack in the door. Then the doorknob slowly turned and he opened the door softly. James's figure stood in the darkness between the doorway. I was frozen, staring at the creepy roommate. I knew it was him sleepwalking. It was still a creepy sight. Then he began making those same growling noises. After a moment, he stopped. A second later, his eyes shot open, and suddenly, he lunged towards me. But in seconds, he had me pinned down. His eyes were blank and expressionless. "Stay still," he said in a monotone voice, as if he was still asleep. "Don't move." I tried to break free, but he was too strong. I felt a deep, intense fear building inside me. And then, just like that, it was over. James released me and slumped off the bed, then lethargically walked back to his room, closing his door softly behind him. I quickly got up and locked my bedroom door, then stayed up for the rest of the night. In the morning, I left for work early, before James even got up. I dreaded the thought of seeing him at home after work, because I knew I would make things awkward. But when I pulled into the driveway, his car wasn't there. I then noticed a lot of things missing from the house, and when I checked his room, it had been emptied. I tried calling James over the next few days, but never got a response. I never heard from him ever again. I have no idea why he left. Maybe he somehow knew what he did and felt ashamed. But if he was truly sleepwalking, then he wouldn't have had any memory of it. It still freaks me out, and my mind associates the encounter with Craigslist, so I stopped using the site. I just hope James really was sleepwalking, because I'm worried that if he wasn't, then he might come back. I had always been a fan of browsing Craigslist for deals and finding unique items that I couldn't find anywhere else. One day I stumbled upon an ad for a vintage record player that was in perfect condition. Couldn't resist sending an email to the seller to inquire about it. To my surprise, the seller responded within minutes, and we quickly began discussing the details of the item. The seller, who went by the name of Jack, seemed friendly and eager to make the sale. We agreed to meet up later that week at his apartment to finalize the purchase. I arrived at the apartment complex at the agreed-upon time and made my way to Jack's unit. As soon as I entered the apartment, I could tell there was something off about the place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Jack welcomed me in, and I noticed he had a strange energy about him. He was jittery and seemed nervous, but I brushed it off as him being an anxious person. I inspected the record player and was pleased to find that it was in even better condition than the pictures had shown. I was ready to make the purchase when Jack suddenly interrupted me, asking if I wanted to see something really cool that he had in the other room. Feeling a bit hesitant, I agreed to follow him. We made our way to a room at the back of the apartment. The room was filled with a ton of objects and things, seeming to be just a collection of complete random. Jack pointed to a large trunk in the corner of the room and said that he had something inside that I might be interested in. As he opened the trunk, I was hit with a musty smell that made me feel lightheaded. Inside the trunk was an old, tattered white sheet. I could tell something was under it, but I didn't care to see anymore. "Sorry, the smell is a lot." turned my head and started walking back to the other room. He stood by the trunk still, calling me back to just take a quick look and saying that I wouldn't regret it. I was too shaken by the strange feelings to even stay. I ignored him and walked right out his door and out of the apartment complex. I was still extremely lightheaded and only seemed to be getting even more so. I stumbled to my car as fast as my feet could carry me. I got in and drove for maybe 20 seconds, barely getting out of the parking lot before I pulled to the side. I felt like I was going to pass out, and I must have, because a few minutes later I woke up. I was groggy and lightheaded, but I managed to drive further down the road and turn into a neighborhood where I pulled over and uncontrollably passed out again. This next part was harder for me to remember, but when I woke, it was darker outside and my head was foggy and unclear. I couldn't make out organized thoughts. Everything was just a blur. I somehow managed to drive home, and as the night went on, I slowly gained more consciousness. As soon as I was able to formulate my thoughts, I called the police. They got to the apartment and were allowed in, but Jack claimed that he had no such trunk, and they never found one. Nothing progressed after that night, but I know something was off. Maybe I am just paranoid, and the smell was just a regular smell that made me freak out for some reason. But I'm pretty sure he had some type of narcotic gas coming from the trunk, and if I stayed much longer, I might have never made it out.